It's Sunday.
Amen. Amen.
And this is the best place to be, isn't it?
Yes.
Around your brothers and sisters in the presence of God, ready to worship. This morning, we're going to talk about pride. I bet we all know somebody that is really proud. And we can usually tell how proud people are because their two favorite words are me and I. They like to tell you how good they are, how wonderful they are. They like to tell you the stories about them. But see, pride's not all about arrogance. Pride can come in the form of self-depreciation as well. I can't do that. Oh, don't call on me. It's the same thing. You see, pride, it's about drawing attention to yourself, and it's a poison that can cause destruction if it's not reined in. There are certain things we can be proud of. We can have a certain amount of pride. When we think of the Bible, and we think of, in particular, I want to think of the birth of Jesus. We see some very humble people in this whole scenario. First of all, there's Mary, the young girl who is chosen to be the mother of the Son of God. And she says, "I'm your servant. May it be as you say." And then there is Joseph, who was going to put Mary away because she was pregnant before their marriage was finished, or before the ceremony was finished. And he too humbled himself before God because he was told to keep her as his wife. And then, of course, there were the shepherds that came and worshiped Jesus the night that he was born. And then later, the Magi, the wise men, that came to see Jesus. But we also see one very prideful player in this story. His name was Herod. He was the king. How did pride affect him? We first see his inability to be humble when the Magi come to visit Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. They come to Jerusalem and they're seeking Jesus. They ask a simple question. They come wanting to know where the King born of the Jews is. Now, when they ask about this, I want you to notice one thing. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 3. When the king heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, why would the king be disturbed about this? Why would the king be concerned because these people came asking, "Where is the one born King of the Jews?" Obviously, Herod is thinking, "I'm King of the Jews. Rome put me in charge. I'm the one that's over the Jews. So who is this they're speaking of?" There's a threat to him. In Herod's defense, he didn't know the prophecies of Jesus. But that's a weak defense, because Herod was raised in a Jewish household. And so he should have known what the Scripture said. And so when he heard this, when these Magi from the east came and said, "Where is this king?" he had to go ask some of the Jews that knew, what are they talking about? What are they talking about, this king of the Jews? What are they talking about? That it's to be born in this area. What are they talking about? And so it was explained to him about the prophecies that we read in the Old Testament. And so now he knows. So Herod knows now that there's a successor, that there's a plan, that he's not always going to be king. And so Herod now devises a plan. He's got to figure out, how do I get rid of this new king? How do I keep my throne? How do I not lose my authority? So he secretly calls the Magi, and he says exactly when this star you're talking about, when did it appear? When did you start following it? And so they tell him, and so he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Well, look at Matthew chapter 2 and verse 8. He says he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go and worship him. You think Herod wanted to go worship the baby? He had no intentions. But he had this plan. He was threatened, and he wanted to do something to change it. He was full of pride. I'm the king. I'm in charge. No one can usurp my authority. Herod wouldn't even put forth the effort to go for himself to worship him. And so when he said worship him, I'm relatively sure he meant kill him. Get rid of him. Dispose of him. But Herod's plan is thwarted. I mean, it's a good plan, right? You go find him, then you come back and tell me where I can find him. The Magi came to the house where Jesus was. This is just a reminder that all the nativity scenes you see are wrong. The wise men never came to the stable. Never. The Bible clearly says when they came to the house where Jesus was. So they come to the house, these wise men, these powerful, rich people, and they humble themselves because they're worshiping this child who is probably around 2 at this time. Probably about 2 years old. Imagine that. These men presenting these expensive gifts and bowing down to a child of about 2 years old. I mean, can you imagine being in your house, you've got your 2-year-old running around doing what 2-year-olds do, and you get a knock at the door. And there's these people dressed in fine garments, much more finer than you ever wore. Can I help you? We're here to see the king. They say this is where he's at. Jesus, come here. You got some company. And there they are, presenting him with these gifts. How do you feel? I mean, these men, they've humbled themselves to travel all this way to present gifts to this child because prophecy has told them this is the King of the Jews. He deserves glory and honor. This is true humility before God. But remember, we said the plan was thwarted because they returned home, but they didn't go back to Herod. They go home a different way. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 12 says, "And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." Again, we see their humility. They listened to this dream. They listened to the voice of God once again. And they go back a different way. This doesn't sit well with Herod. I mean, after all, he's the king. He told them what to do. They didn't do it. He becomes furious. Why? Herod's pride was bruised. Don't you hate it when your pride gets bruised? Don't you hate it when you know you can accomplish something, you know that you're in charge, and you're undercut? His first plan was ruined. I mean, he still could have gone to Bethlehem on his own, but pride wouldn't allow him to do it. His pride would not allow him to travel that far. It's not that far. Not even those days. It wasn't that far. But yet, that would be a sign that he believed, maybe. Maybe it would be a show of humility on his part. So what does he do? Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16 says, "When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi." So he's thinking, this boy by now is about 2 years old. So every 2-year-old male and below in that area, we are going to kill. Boy, doesn't that sound violent? Doesn't that sound evil? That's a man full of pride. I'm not going to allow this to happen. But the one thing you have to think about here, this is the plan of God. Nobody's going to be able to change the plan of God. But when our pride gets hurt, it often does cause us to lash out and become irrational, doesn't it? It's always somebody else's fault. We see a lot of prideful people. We see, maybe on TV and in commercials, we even see it exaggerated to make the point. Remember Leon from the Budweiser commercials years ago? The football player, he was great. Just ask him. They was talking about a loss one time. They're having this mock interview. Said, "What happened out there, Leon? You guys couldn't even compete." He said, "Well, those guys couldn't block. Nobody was doing their job." And finally, the guy interviewing says, "Leon, what about your 6 fumbles?" "Wasn't my fault. Wasn't my fault." See, that's what pride does to us. We can't take responsibility. We can't stand up when we're wrong because our pride is hurt when things don't go the way we think they should or the way we have them planned. And here's Herod. He has now had his pride hurt, so he's lashing out and he's being irrational. I mean, killing all the young boys 2 years old and under? Herod's second plan is foiled as well. Herod now has this great plan from an evil, prideful man. And just think how evil he must be to even come up with this plan. And it's going to work in his mind. But when you think about how evil and wicked Herod is, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Herod killed 3 of his own sons just because he felt threatened by them. Caesar Augustus once said, "It's better to be one of Herod's hogs than it is to be his son." That's how evil he was. That's how bloodthirsty. That's how much he didn't care as long as he thought it was making him look good or protecting him. God made sure that this plan that Herod had wasn't going to touch Jesus. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13 says, "When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. 'Get up,' he said, 'take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.'" There's really no record that tells us how many, if any, of the children in Bethlehem were killed under this order. There are some believe that this is just a myth because it's not recorded in Luke like it is here, but that's a weak argument because there's a lot of things not recorded in Luke that's in Matthew, and vice versa. But there's no record. But to even have an idea that the man could even have a reputation to make this story even seem real, it just tells you how wicked and evil pride can be. You see, pride can be blinding. It doesn't always allow us to see clearly. Remember how Herod reacted to the Magi in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 8, "Go and make a careful search for the child." Herod was disturbed, but he couldn't bring himself to recognize Jesus for who he was. Jesus was truly the King, put forth through the plan of God. You know, one thing about Herod, he was this prideful man, full of arrogance, and he died a very painful death. He had a disease that rotted the skin, and he would stink. And the pain was excruciating. So much so that he often tried to kill himself to get away from the pain. That's the death that he died. You talk about being humbled in death. But see, you might also remember his grandson, the Herod we read about in Acts chapter 12. The Herod that had James killed. Rumor was that he skinned James alive before he beheaded him. And he saw this pleased the Jews, so he imprisoned Peter with the intentions of killing him. Of course, we know how Peter escaped and everything went on. But the Bible tells us that Herod, during a speech, people said, "Oh, it's the voice of God." And he loved that. He loved being called God. And it says that he was struck down, eaten by worms, and died. I always think it's amazing that it says he was eaten by worms and died, not that he died and was eaten by worms. Think about that. How humbling that would be. Humble in death. Pride comes at a high price. A pedestal is a great place to fall from. People will put other people on pedestals. They'll lift them up. They'll set them high. Chances are, whoever's on that pedestal is going to fall. Why? Because we're human. Because we make bad decisions. Because when people put you on a pedestal and people praise you, what happens? Your head can get really big and you lose your balance and you fall off the pedestal. Remember our text from today. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I think of a modern day example. Y'all remember Muhammad Ali? I am the greatest. I mean, he was good. There's no doubt about it, but he wanted to let you know he knew he was good. But do you remember the end of his life? He was humbled in his death. He certainly was not the same man at death as he was when he was full of life. You think about that. Think about how far we can fall. Maybe growing up, you played King of the Mountain. You ever play that? You're probably not allowed today. I mean, you're not allowed to play dodgeball. Can't play lawn darts. I mean, the King of the Mountain, what was the object of the game? Whoever was the king, you was trying to take him down, right? Because you wanted to be King of the Mountain. Everybody else was after you. And a lot of times that's what happens with prideful people, because they're being arrogant and they're letting everybody know how wonderful they are. Somebody's after them. I'm going to take them down. And you know what? Somebody will. If you remember the late singer Jim Croce, he had two songs that come to mind. Bad Bad Leroy Brown. The first song that I remember that had a cuss word in it, it drove people nuts. And You Don't Mess Around with Jim. Both of those songs were about men who thought a lot of themselves and then met their match and were taken down. Somebody is going to take you down when you're full of pride. Paul gives us some outstanding advice about this in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Now, we're given several scriptures to remind us the importance of being humble, the importance of humility. And your homework is to get a concordance and look them up, to see how many times humility and humble is talked about in the Bible. But how do we look at ourselves with sober judgment? This isn't about self-depreciation. It's not about, woe is me, I can't do anything. It's not about that. That's just a form of pride. It's about understanding everything I have, everything I am, is from God. Without God, I am nothing. You are saved by grace through faith. Friends, it doesn't matter how many good deeds we do. It doesn't matter if we've been baptized 14 times. It doesn't matter if I love like crazy. If God did not send Jesus down the cross, there's no salvation. And nobody coerced God into sending Jesus. That was His idea. By grace, you are saved. And as long as we remember that, it's really hard to get arrogant, isn't it? Remember, I have nothing without the grace of God. And so we think of ourselves in that way. One of the most popular preachers of the last century or before was G.K. Chesterton. And he said, how much larger your life would be if yourself could become smaller. Think about what that means. If I just realize my place, if I realize who I am, what I am called to do. And friends, what we need to do, of course, is focus on Jesus. Put our eyes on Him, remembering what He's done for us. See, if we spend more time looking at Jesus and less time looking at ourselves, we'll truly be like Him. Because we'll get to know Him better. We'll understand Him better. And we can see His life and see how we need to live. Think about how Jesus describes Himself. We see it virtually every Sunday on the last slide of every sermon. Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29. What's He say? I am gentle and humble in heart. I mean, if anybody ever had any reason, any call to be arrogant, it was Jesus. He couldn't be stopped. Paul says in Philippians that He humbled Himself. He became as a man, and He emptied Himself. But He even humbled Himself to the point of death. Even death on the cross, which was the lowest, most vile form of death known to man at that time. He was humble. He was humble. And He's gentle. And when you think about it, isn't that why we're on earth? Isn't that what we want to do as Christians? Isn't that why we're here to reflect Jesus? To be like Him? To let His light shine through us. Friends, I believe that we all struggle with pride in some form. Think about it. We talked about being restored a few weeks ago, and we talked about why do we get up in the morning and look in the mirror? Because we want to see what we got to fix before we go out in public. I mean, I've known women that will not even let their husband see them without their makeup on. That is the vanity of vanities. But I've been known to be prideful. Sometimes I won't go out of the house unless I shave. I'm getting better. Sometimes I will now. But we all struggle with pride in some form. Maybe it's arrogance, maybe it's self-depreciation. But friends, the bottom line is we need to know our worth. We need to know that we're all worth the same thing. We were all paid for with the blood of Jesus. And that gives us value. That gives us worth. But it shouldn't make us arrogant, because without the blood of Jesus, I've got no worth. So because of Him, that should not puff us up. It should not make us proud, but make us humble. And being humble doesn't mean being useless. There's a happy medium. Friends, we are not too high and mighty to do any job for God. Jesus washed the feet of His apostles. Washed their feet. Nor are we too low to be a useful servant to God. He's given us talents. He's given us ability. And He knows what we can do. Friends, we are children of the King, and we are workers in His vineyard. So don't allow pride to get in your way.